Lutheran family. This is Pastor Phil with this week's installment of the Faith Time Ministry video series. Hope you'll join us on the 19th for an in-person discussion of these topics where we'll share a meal. And also, if you'd like to, stay afterwards and go caroling to our homebound members. We will be providing lunch, and so please let us know if you're coming. So last week we talked about Advent, the history. We talked about some aspects of our celebration of Advent, like the Advent wreath, the Chrismon tree. We also talked about how there are three different things we think about during Advent that all have to do with Jesus' arrival or coming to us. Last week we talked about how Advent's the season where we remember that Jesus is coming again. At the end of history, the final hope of all creation is Jesus' second arrival. We also talked about how, and we'll talk about this next week, but that Advent is the preparation season for the celebration of the Festival of the Incarnation, Christmas, where we talk about Jesus' first coming. So today we're going to talk about probably the hardest aspect of Advent to understand, because it's pretty easy to say, to see and understand how Advent's about Jesus' first coming, and it's about his second coming. He came to us once as the babe in the manger. He will come again to fulfill all of history, as we hear in the Apostles' Creed. But today we're going to talk about Jesus' continual presence or arrival to us through word and sacrament. So Jesus came once as the babe in the manger. Jesus will come again, but in the meantime, Jesus has promised to be with us, be with his church in special ways through word and sacrament. We call word and sacrament the means of grace. And we could say a lot about that, but how I like to explain it is, the means of grace are how God chooses to be knowable, or how Jesus chooses to be present. Okay? Now, just to expand on that a little bit, sometimes people will say to me, Pastor Phil, I experience God's presence on the golf course, or I experience God's presence on a long run or a long bike ride, or when I'm hiking in the mountains or with my family. And they say, well, if I experience God's presence in those places, what's the point of me coming to church? If I'm getting all I need of God's presence in those things, what's the point of church? And my response is not to downplay our experience of God in our regular lives. I, of course, experience God when I'm with my family. I experience God especially when I'm in nature, when I'm in God's handiwork. I think, since God created nature, that we can especially get a sense of God's awesomeness in nature, in God's creation. There's nothing wrong, and in fact, it is very, very good to experience God in such ways. But as Lutheran Christians, we take the extra step to say that through the means of grace, through word and sacrament, God has chosen to be especially present, specifically present. It kind of makes me think of, it takes the question mark out of how do I commune with God. We can turn that into something that it's not. We can say to ourselves, well, what do I do to experience God? How do I do, what's going to go on? And it's like if you're going to meet a friend. If you were going to meet a friend, the first thing that you would make sure you knew is where you were going to meet, right? You wouldn't just assume that you're meeting at the coffee shop. Maybe you're meeting at the restaurant. You got to talk about it. You have to arrange, where are we going to meet at? The means of grace is God doing that part for us to say, I promise to be there in word and sacrament. And it doesn't really have to do with how we feel. Now, I know feelings play a big part in our experience of God. Sometimes we can feel particularly joyful when we experience God in nature or in other ways. Sometimes in church we probably experience a great deal of joy. But God's presence with us is not dependent upon our joy, or it's not that fickle, because our happiness, our joy, our attention even is fallen like the rest of us. So on the days when we don't feel joyful or we don't feel God's presence, we can be assured that God is still with us. And that's a beautiful thing, I think, because it makes us not doubt God's promises. God's promises, God's showing up to meet us, are not dependent upon our fickle feelings. Now, we hope that we feel joyful. Of course, we seek to experience joy in worship, and we should, especially once in a while. But it's not dependent upon those things. We celebrate that God is with us when we're down in the dumps and when we're on the mountaintops. Both of those places, God is with us. And so, knowing that God comes to us through these means of grace, word, and sacrament, places our faith in God rather than ourselves. So Jesus, and perhaps the way we see this most clearly talked about is in the story of the institution of the Eucharist. So Jesus, having that Last Supper with his disciples, said, "Do this in remembrance of me. Take, eat. This is my body." So Jesus promising to be very closely, physically present with his church as they gather around the celebration of the sacrament. So every time we get together to celebrate the sacrament, Jesus is with us. So that's in Advent, we think about that because that's the way Jesus continually arrives for us. And also through the Word. The Word read from the Holy Scriptures, the Word preached, the Word that we study on our own, the Scriptures. But really when we talk about the Word is Jesus himself, as we see in the Gospel of John, in the prologue to the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And that Word becomes flesh and dwells among us. And then that story of that holy divine person, together with the sacraments that he left us to do, becomes that means by which we celebrate his presence, experience his presence, commune with him. So it takes a lot of the worry, the guesswork out of how do we belong to God. We belong to God through these ways God has set up, the means by which God has chosen to be knowable. So that is the second aspect. Next week we will talk about some of the things it means that God has become incarnate in Christ. Some of the things that the incarnation leads us to believe in and ways it calls us to live. Happy Advent to you, God's blessings, and we will see you in worship.